Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch, and I'm excited to be here. Again, my name is Megan Beyer. I'm a psychologist that specializes in multiple sclerosis, and today I'm going to talk about relationships and how MS can impact relationships, as well as how to grow our network of support. So the objectives for today's talk are to describe the importance of relationships and sort of say why we're even talking about this topic today, to identify who is your inner circle, who you can rely on for support, to build and strengthen lasting connections, or how to strengthen those connections of your inner circle, and how to communicate your needs effectively to others, both as a person with MS and for support partners. So I'm going to start by talking about why are relationships even a topic for today? Well, I don't know if people know this kind of data, so I think it's really important to start here. I'm going to start with marriages and long-term partnerships, because that's usually what people think of when they think of relationships, but I'm going to expand beyond that. In unhappy marriages or in unhappy partnerships, this is true for same-sex couples as well as heterosexual couples. Being in an unhappy partnership raises your chance of getting sick by 35%, and it shortens life by an average of 4 to 8 years. Pretty drastic. In people with MS, being in unhappy relationships can reduce your overall functioning, and it can increase your quality of life, but several studies have looked at whether it increases your chances of divorce, and most people would probably hypothesize yes, but actually when we look at all of the numbers, overall there isn't an increased risk of divorce or separation in people with MS. On the flip side, being in a satisfying partnership or a satisfying marriage has shown people have increased immunity to things like the flu, improved overall physical health, higher white blood cell counts, and more natural killer cells that can effectively fight off disease. So one of the researchers that does a lot of work in this area, John and his wife, Julie Gottman, they've made sort of this statement that I might not say to your actual doctor, but he said that improving your partnerships or your relationships is better than going to the gym every day. Now, obviously, that's his research, so that's what he cares about. I would not say that you should not go to the gym. But it's definitely an important part of improving your overall quality of life in people with MS. So let's look at other kinds of relationships. Similar themes here for child and parent relationships. If you have a good relationship with your child or your parent, you have fewer infectious diseases like the cold or the flu. Your child has lower rates of psychological diagnoses. Your children tend to have better grades, and they create their own stronger social support networks. Friends and siblings. If you have good friendships and good sibling relationships, people tend to have less stress, longer lives, better health, recover more quickly from illnesses, and have fewer infections. How about relationships at work? Less stress, reduced turnover, less burnout, and increased productivity. Hear any themes? Overall, better health when you have good relationships and good support networks. So let's talk a little bit about some of the concerns. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to bring up some of the things that I have heard from people in my own practice about why relationships are impacted by MS and some of the concerns that they've brought to the table. So this is an example. Tony, diagnosed at age 25, is single. He described several questions and fears about how MS would impact dating. Where do I meet people? How much should I say on the first date? Will my diagnosis scare potential partners? Do these kinds of questions ring true for anyone, even if you're not single, but maybe even developing new friendships? Raise a hands. Yeah, okay. How about some other questions? When and how do I talk to people about MS, especially new people that are in my life? How do I talk about MS at work? And I think we heard a little bit about that this morning, but it's still a very vulnerable area. How do I talk to my kids about having MS? I recently worked with two different couples who one of the partners in the relationship had been living with MS for over a decade, and neither had told their kids that they had MS. So they really struggled with what to say to their children. What do I say to my friends or my colleagues, my family members, when fatigue causes me to break plans again? Are they going to keep inviting me? What are people thinking when I can't get my words out? I've heard so many times people say that they don't go out to dinner outings, or they don't go out with friends, or they stop talking because they just can't get their words out and they're so afraid of what other people are thinking of them or how that's making them appear. These things sound familiar to people? Raise of hands. Yeah, I see a lot of hands going up. Okay, so the major themes in all of these questions are trust. Who can we trust? How do we trust? How do we build trust? Vulnerability, putting yourself out there. When you put yourself out there and you talk about these things, it's a very vulnerable experience, and there's some risk in that, right? And how to communicate your needs, or how to communicate about your symptoms effectively, so that other people might have a better chance of understanding. So who can you lean on? I recently was part of a support group where somebody mentioned that she had difficulty figuring out who she should talk to about certain things because some people responded differently. So how do we find that inner circle of people that we can really trust and lean on? So here's an example from an article that was in Momentum magazine. Karen said that she had a neighbor in Michigan where she lived who was like a second mother to her. Meeting her at the hospital, regularly walking across the lawn to bring her dinner. And she said, those are the people I need to pay attention to, because those are the people who are paying attention to me. So who are those kind of people in your life? And I want to tell you a story that's from a book called Daring Greatly. This is a researcher, a relationship researcher named Brene Brown. If you haven't heard of her, she's fantastic. Look her up. She talked about marble jar friends, or marble jar people. So where this comes from is that her daughter was in a classroom where the teacher had a marble jar. And when the classroom as a whole was doing well, they were treating each other well, she would add marbles to the jar. When the class was acting up or being mean to each other, she would take marbles out. And when the marble jar got to the top, they would have some sort of party, like a pizza party or something like that, right? So one day, Dr. Brown's daughter came home from school. She walked in the door, she slammed the door, she stood next to the door and just slid down the wall, tears coming out of her eyes. And she said, I'm never going to trust anyone ever again. And her mom ran over and said, what's going on? What happened? And she said, you know, at school, she told somebody a secret. And then by the time she got back from recess, the entire classroom knew the secret, and they were all laughing at her. And you know, her mom at the time was thinking, how do I handle this, right? Because we need to learn how to trust, but who do we trust with our secrets? Who do we trust with those vulnerable pieces of information? And she thought of the marble jar, and she said, you know, we need to share our secrets, our vulnerabilities with people who are like a marble jar, who over time, they've demonstrated to us that they are putting marbles in our jar. And those marbles are small things, right? She described her daughter saying, after she told her this sort of metaphor, her daughter said, you know, I have marble jar friends. Those are the friends who save a seat for me at lunch. Those are the friends who do the half butt sit with me, where, you know, two kids sitting on the same seat, right? One half butt, the other. And she thought about her own life. Dr. Brown thought about her own life, and she said, I have marble jar friends too, who remember that I have, the names of all of my parents, or the people who will call me when something big is coming up, right? They're those small acts that show us that that other person is thinking of us and that cares. And I think the point here that I want to make is that trust is not one big event. Trust is not one big thing that happens. It's small behaviors, small words over time that show us that we can trust that other person. So I want to take this a little bit further. When we're thinking about trust, We want to find who is in our circle and who is not in our circle. So I have a patient who, when I first saw her, and this kind of gets to a conversation we were having over here on the side, that she did not look like she was physically disabled, but she had really severe fatigue. And so she was not using her handicap placard to park in a handicap spot when she would go to Target, because she was really afraid that people would think that she was parking in that spot incorrectly, or that she was taking the spot from somebody who needed it. And as we worked together, she started to realize that she needed to use a cane, but she did not want to use a cane because she was afraid of what other people would think of her, that she didn't actually need that cane. And so we want to take a step back and start to look at who we're putting our time and energy into in terms of what people think. So if we care what everyone thinks, like these examples, maybe if we care what everyone off the street, somebody that we don't even know very well, thinks of us, then that can be really difficult to be brave and to be vulnerable, right? But if we don't care what anyone thinks, then we can't connect to others in a really meaningful way. So we need to kind of go between those two extremes and figure out who are the people that we really care about, that we know really care about us, that when we ask them a true question, they're going to be honest with us, that they're going to tell us when, we need to get a kick in the pants, or when we need to sit down and relax. Who are the people that you know that are between these two extremes? And so one way that Brene Brown talks about doing this is taking a 1 inch by 1 inch square and thinking about the people in your life who opinions really matter to you. And there shouldn't be so many people that it overruns the square. It really should only be a few people that can fit into this square. They're your square squad, right? These are the people that when you really need somebody to lean on, you can call them up and you can say, I'm having a rough day today. Could you bring me dinner? Or could I, talk to you about this situation? So, we're limited on time here, but if you get a chance sometime today or later this weekend, think about or write down who would be these people that are in your square squad, so that who are, you can start to think about who are the people that are most important. But not every person can meet every need. So thinking back to that person I talked about earlier that's in the support group, she said, my mom is really good at doing very physical task-oriented things. She's good at making dinner and bringing it when I need me. She's good at driving me to doctor's appointments. But if I talk to her about something that's vulnerable, I don't feel better afterwards. So for her mom was somebody that she could really rely on for physical support, but she needed somebody else for emotional support. So she talked about friendships, who, when she talked to them, she felt better after that she felt like she was less vulnerable, stronger, that she could face the world better, right? So think not only just who you can rely on, but who can you rely on for different tasks, right? Some people are going to be better for some things and others for others. So, when it comes to the emotional realm, if you tell somebody, I have a good friend of mine who says she has her safe list, is what she calls it. And she says, when I share something really vulnerable or personal with that person, I feel safer, I feel more connected, I feel stronger. But if I tell somebody something that's vulnerable and difficult, and I feel worse after that conversation, I feel put down, I don't feel like I'm moving forward, then I really think twice again before telling them another vulnerable thing. Now, that doesn't mean that can't change over time. I don't want people to just automatically go in a box that you never trust them again. But I think it's important to sort of think about how you feel after you have conversations and start to recognize who are the people that you feel more comfortable and stronger with after you have those conversations. So how do we strengthen those conversations? And even if you have somebody that maybe you didn't feel great about one time, but maybe that relationship can change and can get stronger. So how do we build and strengthen those connections? So there's another researcher, the Gottmans, that I referred to earlier. They kind of talk about this marble jar experience in a little bit of a different way, and they call them bids for connection. So these are the small things. So, he talked about one of his famous stories is that, his wife was in the bathroom. They were both getting ready to go to bed. He really wanted to read the end of this mystery novel that he'd been looking forward to all day. He wanted to see what happened, who did who done it sort of thing, right? And then he noticed that his wife was starting to tear up. And he thought to himself, I could either pretend that I didn't see that and run in and sit down in bed and start reading and ignore it, or I could go up to her and I could start talking to her and find out what's going on, right? And we all kind of have these, what he refers to as sliding door moments, right? Where we can make choices to either connect with the people around us or choose not to connect. And when we connect those bids, when we put those bids out there and other people choose to connect with us, then that creates this bid connection kind of response. Each exchange can strengthen or weaken a relationship. So if you put a bid out there and somebody doesn't respond to that bid, that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, like maybe you don't want to put another bid out there for connection, right? But if you put something out there and the other person responds to it, then you feel more connected to that person and it starts to strengthen. So positive responses lead to continued interaction. Negative responses can shut down communication or connection. And what do I mean by this? So he talks about 3 responses that we can have to bids for connection. One is called turning towards, or I say here, kind of welcoming connection. An example of that is kind of like John saying, telling a lighthearted joke and his friend laughing. Right? That's very simple, but he tells a joke and somebody laughs. If he told a joke and his friend kind of rolled his eyes and said, "That's not funny, don't quit your day job," then that would not be a positive turning towards type of connection, right? Depending on the relationship, I guess. Turning away is ignoring a bid or acting preoccupied. So in that story that I told about John Gottman, if he had ignored his wife's tears and gone and sat down, that would have been a turning away moment, right? And this can lead to hostility and defensiveness in couples. And what they've found is that when people don't respond to bids by ignoring them, that rebids happen only 0 to 20% of the time. So it's important for us to try and recognize when we are responding and when we're not. There's some more research that looked at mothers and children or babies, and what they said was that this is not an all or nothing thing, right? That we can learn to build connections over time. And when new mothers bring home their babies, 70% of the time they're missing their baby's bids for connection. But as they start to get to know their child and their child gets to know them, that 70% declines and the relationship grows over time. And so, we may be missing connections, but it doesn't mean that our relationships are doomed, right? We can practice this and we can get better at it. So an example is that, Sarah says, I got a call from a neurologist today, and Joe looks up from his phone and says, what time are we meeting your sister for dinner? He completely missed the comment, right? That she was potentially putting something vulnerable out there, and he kind of ignored it or missed it. Turning against is kind of these argumentative things. It's responding to bids with arguments or sarcasm, and this causes people to withdraw. So Sue tells Jen she's feeling really fatigued and not up for their planned evening with friends, and Jen says, again, I guess I better just give up any hope for a social life. So it's kind of that sarcastic response, and that really causes people to withdraw. Here's an example of all 3, right? A daughter runs up, I put this in here because I have a 2-year-old, and I've actually had this experience with her hands covered in paint, and I wanted to respond the last way, but I tried not to. So a daughter excitedly calls out, "Mom, look at my hands." And turning towards would be something like, "Wow, look how many colors." okay, let's come over here and wash your hands, right? Like you're connecting with your child's excitement. Turning away is, where's your brother? It's time for dinner. Just completely ignoring what she's saying. Or against, which is, really, look at this mess you made. Don't touch anything, right? We've all responded in all of these ways, but what's important is that most of the time we're turning towards. Not 100% of the time, that's probably impossible for all of us. But the research shows that if you turn towards most of the time, your relationships will grow and build and strengthen over time. So communicating your needs. Polling question. I want you all to raise your hands, and you can raise your hands for more of these. When I share something personal and vulnerable, I like the person listening to make eye contact. Raise your hand. Okay. Look away so I don't feel self-conscious. Okay. Hug me. Okay. A few people. Give me some space. Okay. A couple people here. Respond right away. A few. Yep. Okay. Stay quiet and listen. Lots of hands. Okay. And anything else? Is there other things that you like people to do when you're telling something vulnerable that's not on this list? No? Okay. So I think the main point here is that all of us have multiple ways that we like having people respond to us when we're sharing something vulnerable, and it's not the same for everyone. And that's really important because we need to start to get to know the people in our lives and what ways they like to be responded to when they are sharing something vulnerable. How about when someone shares something painful or personal with you, do you worry about saying the wrong thing? I know I do. Yeah. Lots of hands. Want to say something really comforting? Lots of hands. Okay. Get nervous? A few hands. Yeah. I think that's really normal to feel nervous when people are sharing something really personal and vulnerable. Worry about not feeling anything? Okay. A few hands. Don't know what to do? A few hands. Yeah, absolutely. Want to fix it? Yes, 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 lots and lots of hands. Who gets annoyed when their partner tries to fix it when they're sharing something? Lots of hands. Yeah, a few hands there. Is there other things on this list that you feel when somebody's sharing something personal that we didn't put on here? No? Okay. Okay. So what's really important, and I think for both of these, is again that for both of those polling questions, individuals have unique needs, and they have things that they like and dislike, and then they have their own worries about when somebody is sharing something personal with them. And so it's really important for us to start learning how to listen and communicate with each other so that we can learn how we can turn towards or build up our own marble jars or others around us, right? So it's really important to take turns. And how many of you have ever been in kind of an argument or a discussion and the person's talking and you're just thinking about how you're going to respond to that person? Yeah, I think we all fall into that trap sometimes, right? So it's really important when you're in those conversations that you start to take a step back and really listen to what the person is saying. It may even be helpful to start writing down some notes for what they're saying, so that you really recognize what's being communicated, and that can be helpful because when we get emotionally flooded, it can be really hard to focus on the other person's perspective and what they're saying. And it can also help, especially with those of us in the room who have multiple sclerosis or who are aging, who have other things that could impact cognition. Jotting down some notes can be really helpful for keeping track of what's happening in the conversation. It's also important to manage your emotions when you're in difficult conversations, because we can get easily flooded when we're sharing something vulnerable or when we get into arguments or disagreements with others. And what I mean by flooded is that period of time when, raise of hands, have you ever been in a discussion and later on you thought to yourself, man, I should have said A, B, C, D, or E, and I didn't say any of those things because they didn't come to mind, right? Yeah. So when your heart rate gets above 100 beats per minute, your executive functioning, your frontal lobes turn off or they turn down. And so it's very hard to think clearly, to problem solve, and to really hear the other person's perspective because you're in fight or flight mode. And so in those moments, you're getting flooded. And so what the Gottmans recommend, who've done all this research on relationships, is that when you start to feel yourself flooded, you should take at least a 20 to 30 minute break and return to the conversation later. Especially for men, men tend to stay up and activated for longer than women. Women tend to be able to, at least from their research, tend to bring themselves down quicker. But taking a 20 to 30 minute break and coming back to the conversation can be really helpful. And it's really, the important part of that is coming back to the conversation, not just ignoring it and moving on. Eliminate distractions. I think this is a key one for people with MS, right? That kids, television, radio, those things in the background make it really difficult to hear and pay attention to and maintain your concentration. So wherever you can, eliminating distractions can be really helpful for having these kinds of vulnerable conversations. And repeat back what you heard. So in the Gottmans books about having these kinds of conversations, they talk about repeating when the person is done talking, not only taking turns, but this person A is talking and sharing their perspective. Person B says or summarizes what they heard. And then person A gets a chance to say, nope, that's not quite right. Here's how I'm feeling. Person B summarizes again until they got it right, and then they switch roles. The other person shares their perspective. This person summarizes. When you summarize, it does not mean you agree with that person's point. It just means that you heard them. How good does it feel when you know that somebody else has heard you, even if they don't agree with you, right? If they can just share your perspective, if they can repeat back that they actually listened to what you have to say, it makes such a difference. And that doesn't mean that you agree with them, but you have a starting place. You have a place to continue the conversation and to problem solve. So that repeating back gives that other person the perspective that you've heard them. Some more tips for successful difficult conversations are starting soft. And what that means by starting soft is, here's the difference. How dare you leave the keys locked in the car, right? Versus, I know it's been really hard because you've been pretty distracted lately and you have a lot on your mind, but it's really difficult when we have to call out the locksmith 5 times in a week because you locked the keys in the car. How can we problem solve this, right? Very different. So a soft start is kind of starting with some acknowledgement of what might be going on, recognizing the other person's perspective, and not immediately yelling at the other person. The research shows that if you start the beginnings of conversations with others are the best predictor of the overall outcome. So if you can start soft and you can start with empathy, then the likelihood is that the conversation will end better. Does that mean that it always ends better? No, but it has a better chance. Describe what is happening rather than accusing the other person. So kind of like you're a newspaper reporter and you're describing what the events are like a fly on the wall. So describing what's happening can be really helpful for helping both of you stay in the moment and understanding each other. Avoiding judgment, blame, or criticism. Using I instead of you. I think we've all probably heard that, right? Using I statements. Doesn't always help, but it does help to listen. If you say you, it does automatically put somebody on edge. Using I statements does tend to take the edge off of it. being polite, using humor. So I remember when I was growing up, even when my dad, one thing that I recognized even before I went to grad school is that when my dad and I would get into arguments, he would always sort of crack a joke halfway through, and then we'd end up laughing, and then we'd, kind of resolve the situation. And I always remembered that, I always kind of recognized that and realized that humor sometimes helped to bring down the intensity of the conversation and bring us back onto track. And so sometimes using humor, if it's not used in a bad way, can help reduce the intensity of difficult conversations. Find opportunities for agreement. And what we mean by that is that if the other person, even if you don't agree with the other person 99%, maybe there's something that you can recognize and agree with. So maybe you recognize that their emotion, and you can say, I recognize when this happens that it's easy to feel angry, right? So try to find some opportunities for agreement and be curious about your partner's perspective and why and how they came to that point. Finally, I kind of want to end with paying attention to your body language. And so things like eye rolling, mimicking the other person, scoffing, turning away, or avoiding eye contact or acting busy. These all kind of fit into categories that John Gottman referred to as the 4 horsemen. And these are things that really damage relationships and really shut down communication. And so if you can avoid these things in an argument, you're going to do a lot better. And I think one of the main points is that every relationship is going to have its ups and downs, and every relationship is going to have difficulties and rough spots. And it's okay to argue and get in disagreements with people. But if you can do it without using these kinds of body language, or without this kind of body language, then we're going to end up being a lot better. Questions?
Any questions from our in-person audience? Too shy to ask your question in front of your support partner? Okay, well, you guys think about that, and if you have any, jot some down. But we got a question in from a virtual participant. Actually, it's on my phone. Let me pull that up. And let's see here. This is Megan. I know my mother loves me and wants to support me, but I feel that she's constantly nagging me about managing my MS. How can I establish proper boundaries without hurting her feelings? And this is from Amy.
That's a great question. I hear this a lot. So there's usually kind of 2 extremes to this, right? People feel like their support partners are doing too much for them, or kind of being overprotective, or maybe that they're not doing enough. And I also hear from support partners that people with MS are trying to do too much and it's dangerous, or they're not putting as much effort forward as the support partner thinks they're capable of. And so here, I think it's really important to think about how to communicate needs and to understand what the other person's fear is. So I think where I would start is asking a lot of questions of mom. What's going through her mind? What are her fears? And trying to understand what her perspective is, so that she can have a better understanding. And then it might be asking her to really listen to the frustrations that, is it Amy? Amy had, that Amy has with the amount of kind of overprotection or over concern. So really trying to have those communications with her mom. If that's not possible and it's not going anywhere, then I do think it's helpful to try to set some boundaries. And what I mean by that is maybe limiting sharing some information, but not sharing too much information, or kind of thinking about who else might be a good support person in her life. Yeah.
got a comment, if you can just wait for the mic.
When you first started talking, you talked about the person that was afraid to park in the handicap parking place. I have found since my diagnosis and my different therapists have asked me to use mobility aids because of the fatigue issue from walking too far or anything like that. Do you have any suggestions on how to get over? To me, it's almost like a fear. Like I parked today and I was going back and forth in my mind, should I use my mobility scooter? Should I leave it in the car? And I'm a patient here at Shepherd, so I knew I had a long ways to go. Any suggestion? I mean, it's very uncomfortable because everybody thinks you look great, but yet you aren't, so.
Right.
It's just a big fear I have. I don't know if other people have that fear or not, but it's kind of embarrassing too.
Absolutely. I think this is a normal thing that a lot of people with MS go through. And it's something that I hear a lot and that I process a lot. I think a starting point is deciding whose opinion matters and whose opinion doesn't. It doesn't mean that it's not uncomfortable if somebody says something rude to you in the parking lot when they think that you're okay and they don't understand your diagnosis. Of course, that's going to provoke anger and frustration and, some negative emotions. But I think the thing to take a step back with, as much as you're capable of or able to, is to take a step back and say, in the long run, does this person's opinion of me matter? And is what I'm doing going to help me in the long run or hurt me in the long run? And that's easier said than done, right? Because we're kind of socialized to pay attention to what people think of us. And so then I would start to think about having a conversation in your mind if those thoughts start to get stuck there, right? Of, what if somebody thinks this, or what if somebody says something? It's kind of reminding yourself when those thoughts pop up in your mind and people think that I look okay, then I might say back to myself, sort of have this internal conversation of, yes, people might think that, but my therapists are giving me this recommendation for a reason, and I'm having a negative outcome. So the one thing that I'll follow up with that story of the patient that I had, she eventually started using both mobility aids and the placard because her husband started saying to her, when you get home, you're so exhausted that we can't do anything. We can't go out to dinner. We can't, she wasn't able to kind of spend time with her son because she was having to lay down and take naps. And he said, looking at big picture, what relationships are being impacted if you make that decision? Or what else are the negative consequences of making that decision based on what other people think of you? So she said, yeah, I have gotten some nasty looks. I have gotten a note on my car saying that I shouldn't be parking here. But in the end, I'm able to spend time with my son. I'm able to actually do things with my husband in the evening because I made the choice to save some of that energy. So it's not an easy thing. And I'm not saying that it's easy or that, that we're ever going to be able to get rid of those short moments of discomfort. But think of them that way, that they're short moments, that they're rain clouds that are kind of over you, but they will pass. And in 5 years, is that event going to matter, or is the relationship or the things that you chose to do with that extra energy more important? Easier said than done. Yeah.
We got another question from a virtual participant that asks, at what point should you seek couples counseling? And how would you recommend that I suggest this to my partner if the partner isn't open to it?
I think couples counseling is good for everyone, but I'm biased because I'm a psychologist. So I think we can all learn to communicate more effectively. And so couples counseling is always good. But what I would say is that couples counseling I definitely recommend when you're having those difficult conversations and they're not going anywhere. You're having those difficult conversations and you're not able to problem solve. When you're just kind of missing each other and not able to hear each other's perspective, because sometimes having that third person in the room to kind of reflect back and jump in when it gets too heated to try and bring it back around is really helpful. So one way that I know some of my patients have presented it to partners who are less inclined is that, you know, if you have somebody that is a health psychologist or a counselor with health experience, it may be sort of like bringing that person in as some education about MS, or I sometimes will say, you know, it's really important for me to get the other person's perspective so I can work with that person individually. So it's important for my patient's partner to share with me their perspective so I can understand how to work more effectively with them individually. And so sometimes that kind of carrot of that person being able to share their perspective and that they're not going to counseling is a good place to start.
Any questions? Any more questions? Okay. Well, Megan's here, so if you do think of questions, you can catch her at the break, which we're going to lead into now. Thank you, Megan.